You know that moment when your own daughter gets up at her wedding and decides to roast you in front of 200 guests? Well, it happened to me. But what happened next? Let's just say the room went from laughing at me to complete silence. In about 30 seconds, picture a beautiful venue, crystal chandeliers, everyone dressed to the nines. My daughter, Emily, looked absolutely stunning in her white gown, and I was so proud to watch her marry the love of her life. The reception was going perfectly until she took the microphone for what I thought would be a sweet acceptance speech. Instead, she smiled at the crowd and said, "I want to talk about my mom for a minute. She's going through what I would call a midlife crisis." The room chuckled. She's decided at 60 that she wants to build an empire. She actually made air quotes, and the laughter got louder. We keep telling her she should act her age, but she won't listen. I sat there, smiling, dying inside, while 200 people laughed at my so-called crisis. But what none of them knew, including my own daughter, while they were all making fun of a crazy old lady trying to play business, was that the most powerful man in the room was sitting quietly at table 6. Because, you see, what happened next involved Emily's new husband's boss standing up, nearly choking on his champagne, looking at me in shock, and uttering 5 words that changed everything. But to understand how my daughter's wedding turned into the most satisfying moment of vindication of my life, I need to take you back 2 years to when it all began. Before we go any further, please leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and subscribe to Still Got It. We're building a community of incredible people who know that our best chapters can happen at any age. Now, back to the story. 2 years earlier, I was Diane Moore, 60, recently divorced and, frankly, feeling pretty lost. After 30 years as an office manager, I'd been laid off when the company restructured, which, let's be honest, usually means they replaced older employees with younger, cheaper ones. For the first time in decades, I was truly on my own. Emily was 32 and living with her fiancé Jake. My ex-husband had married a woman 15 years his junior, because apparently that's what men do during their real midlife crises. And here I was, sitting in my tiny apartment, wondering what the hell I was supposed to do with the rest of my life. But here's the thing about being 60 and suddenly unemployed. You have 2 choices. You can either accept that your best years are behind you, or you can decide that all those years of experience might actually be worth something. I chose the latter. I started a consulting business, helping small companies with their operations and efficiency. Nothing glamorous, just using the skills I'd developed over 3 decades of keeping offices running smoothly. I called it consulting. Simple, professional, and it kept my personal name hidden. The problem was, no one in my family took it seriously. Emily would roll her eyes whenever I mentioned a new client. "Mom, you're 60, not 23. Maybe it's time you started acting your age," she'd say. Jake was even worse, constantly trying to patronizingly explain basic business concepts to me as if I were a kid playing dress-up. "Have you considered getting a real job instead of this entrepreneurial phase?" My sister would ask during family dinners. "Diana, you blew your chance. Just accept it and find something stable." Even my friends, while well-intentioned, were hurtful in their comments. "It's sweet that you're trying," they'd say. "But realistically, how much can you really accomplish starting from scratch at your age?" The worst part was that I was actually good at what I did. Really good. My clients were thriving, my contracts were growing, and I was making more money than I ever had as an office manager. But every time I tried to share my success with my family, they patted me on the head like I was a toddler who'd managed to tie her shoes. Emily was planning her own wedding at the time, and she made it clear that she didn't want me to tell Jake's coworkers who would be attending about my small business. "Please don't embarrass me by telling people you're an entrepreneur," she said. "Just say you're between jobs or something." I agreed, because I loved my daughter and wanted her wedding day to be perfect. But as I sat there, listening to her friends make fun of my crisis while I quietly footed half the wedding bills they didn't even know about, I began to realize something. My family wasn't just unsupportive, they were actively shaming me for refusing to quietly fade into midlife invisibility. And that hurt more than any layoff ever could. The wedding day arrived, and it was absolutely beautiful. Emily had picked this gorgeous venue with crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the garden. I'd helped pay a fair share of it, by the way, although she'd simply assumed the money had come from my divorce settlement, and not my thriving business. I'd dressed carefully that morning, nice but not flashy, elegant but not conspicuous. The last thing I wanted was to upstage the bride on her special day. Emily had asked me, however, not to mention my consulting work to Jake's colleagues who would be in attendance. And I promised. to keep quiet about my success. Just melt away, Mom, she said during the rehearsal dinner. Jake's boss, Mr. Johnson, will be there with his wife, plus a bunch of people from his tech company. These are serious business people, so please don't start talking about your little projects. I bit my tongue and nodded. Little projects, right? The ceremony was perfect. Emily looked like a princess. Jake seemed genuinely happy, and I cried tears of joy, watching my daughter begin this new chapter. During cocktail hour, I mingled quietly, making small talk with other family members and staying away from the crowd of Jake's colleagues. But I couldn't help but overhear some of their conversations. These tech people were discussing business, deals, market strategies, recent acquisitions in their industry. I knew more about their sector than they probably realized, but I kept quiet and smiled politely as I was introduced as the mother of the bride. Then dinner began, and everything was going smoothly until the bridesmaid decided to make a speech. She started off sweetly, talking about their friendship and how beautiful the wedding had been, but then changed the subject. Now I need to talk about the bride's family, she said with a grin. Especially Emily's mother, who's been quite the character lately. Groom chuckled, and I felt my stomach drop. Diana's going through what I would call a midlife crisis, she continued, and the laughter grew louder. At 60, she decided she wanted to build an empire. She actually made air quotes, and I wanted to fall through the table. We keep telling her she should act her age, but she doesn't listen. She's trying to compete with people half her age in business. More laughter. But hey, at least she's doing something and not just gardening like the average mom her age, right? The entire room was laughing now. 200 people, all enjoying a good joke at my expense. I sat there with a frozen smile, my cheeks burning with humiliation, as the bridesmaid continued her hot story. We still love our misguided mom, she finished to applause and more laughter. But the worst part wasn't the bridesmaid's speech. The worst part was watching Emily's face as it happened. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't trying to stop it. She was laughing too, nodding as if it was perfectly acceptable. As the bridesmaid sat down, Emily stood up to give her own speech. I thought maybe she'd balance things out, say something nice about me. Instead, she doubled down. Thanks for that, Amanda. Yeah, my mom has definitely been on an adventure lately, Emily said into the microphone. She keeps insisting she's building a business empire, but we're just trying to get her to accept that some dreams have an expiration date. When you're in your 60s, maybe it's time to be realistic about what you can actually achieve. The room erupted in laughter again. Jake's colleagues were practically in tears. Mr. Johnson shook his head with an amused smile. Even the waiters seemed to be trying not to laugh as they cleared away plates. I wanted to run. I wanted to disappear. But most of all, I wanted my daughter to stop publicly humiliating me on what should have been one of the happiest days of both our lives. But we still support Mom's hobby, Emily continued. Even if it means listening to her talk about client meetings and business strategy like she's some kind of CEO. The way she said it, with such derogatory mockery, finally broke. Something in me, it wasn't just unsupportive, it was cruel. And it was happening in front of everyone who mattered to her new husband's career. In front of people who could be valuable connections to my actual business if they knew the truth. When Emily finished her speech to thunderous applause, I felt completely defeated. It wasn't just it was cruel. And it was happening in front of everyone who mattered to her new husband's career. I decided I'd had enough humiliation for one evening. I'd slip out quietly after dinner, maybe claiming I wasn't feeling well. The last thing I wanted was to cause more drama on Emily's special day, even though my heart was completely broken. After Emily's speech, I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. People started approaching my table with that condescending sympathy that made my skin crawl. Good for you for trying something new at your age, one of Jake's aunts said, patting me on the shoulder as if I were a brave little girl trying to ride a bike. It's never too late to chase your dreams, no matter how small. Another guest added with a patronizing smile. My neighbor started selling jewelry at 60, made almost $300 last year. Jake's coworkers were even worse. When someone introduced me as the entrepreneurial mother of the bride, they nodded politely and immediately changed the subject. I could practically see them thinking, oh, another middle-aged woman with a cute little side hustle. One of them actually said, that's great. My mother-in-law started making crafts on Etsy. It helps her stay busy, as if I were some kind of charity case who needed a hobby to fill her empty days. But the absolute worst moment came when Jake pulled me aside during cocktail hour. Diane, thanks for holding up so well after your speeches, he said. No, Emily was just kidding, but I didn't want you to feel bad about your consulting thing. My consulting thing, I repeated. Yeah, well, It's great that you're staying active and trying new things, but I hope you're not putting too much pressure on yourself to make a big deal out of it. At your age, it's more about staying involved than actually building a career, right? I stared at him. This was my son-in-law. This was the man my daughter had chosen to spend her life with. And he was basically telling me to know my place. Jake, I said carefully. What exactly do you think I do? He shrugged. Some small business consulting. Emily mentioned you helping local stores with their paperwork or something. That's nice. Every little bit helps when you're starting over as an adult. Local stores. Paperwork? Starting over as an adult. I nodded and excused myself to go to the ladies' room, where I sat in a stall and tried not to cry. My own family thought I was some amateur playing at business. They had no idea that in the last 18 months, I'd acquired 6 companies. 6. Including a major tech firm that was probably worth more than Jake would make in his entire career. As I walked back out, I overheard Emily talking to one of her bridesmaids at the bar. Poor mom. Emily was saying she was so lost after the divorce. This whole business thing is just her way of feeling important again. We don't have the heart to tell her it's never going to work out. That's so sad, her friend replied. But at least she's busy, and not one of those sad empty nest moms who calls her kids every day. Exactly. And frankly, I'd rather her play business than date again. Can you imagine? They both laughed, and something in me just snapped. This wasn't just about being undervalued anymore. My own daughter genuinely believed I was a pathetic middle-aged woman desperately clinging to significance. She thought my success was a figment of my imagination, my ambition a delusion, and my accomplishments just sad attempts to feel important. The irony was devastating. While Emily worried that I'd become a sad, empty nest mom, I knew the truth about what I'd actually built. While she was embarrassed for her coworkers to meet her entrepreneurial mother, that same mother had accomplished more than anyone in the room realized. I hung on for the rest of the dinner, smiling and nodding. As more people offered well-intentioned but insulting advice about realistic expectations for women my age, I had planned to leave quietly after the cake cutting, maybe blame a headache, and leave the newlyweds to enjoy their party. But then something happened that I certainly didn't expect. During the post-dinner social, Mr. Johnson approached me. I had been trying to avoid Jake's boss all evening, not wanting to endure another conversation about my cute little consulting hobby. Mrs. Moore, he said politely. I believe we haven't been properly introduced. I'm Robert Johnson, Jake's boss at Sterling Tech. Sterling Tech? My heart nearly stopped. Actually, Ms. Moore, I managed to say. And yes, I know who you are. He smiled. Jake mentioned that you do business consulting. That's great. What kind of work do you do? I looked at Robert Johnson, this polite man who had no idea what was about to happen, and I knew that this conversation was going to be very, very interesting. Well, Mr. Johnson, I began carefully. I work in mergers and acquisitions and operations consulting. I help companies optimize their efficiency and growth potential. He nodded politely. Sounds exciting. Mostly small local businesses, I believe. Actually, I focus on mid-market companies in the technology sector, I replied. Firms that are ready to scale but need strategic guidance and capital investment. His eyebrows rose slightly. Really, it's quite a niche. How long have you been in this business? About 2 years. Seriously, although I've been working towards this for years. Impressive, he said, although I realized he still thought I was talking about much smaller deals than I was actually involved with. Have you worked with companies I might know? I paused. This was the moment when I could either continue to evade the question or be honest. After everything that had happened tonight, I was tired of hiding. Actually, yes. I recently completed the acquisition of Sterling Technologies. The change in his expression was immediate and dramatic. His polite smile froze, then slowly faded, and his eyes widened. Sterling Technologies. Yes. The deal closed about 3 months ago. He looked at me for a long moment, and I watched the pieces of the puzzle fall into place in his head. Wait a minute. Sterling Technologies was acquired by DM Consulting. His voice dropped. You don't mean to say I'm D. Moore? Yes. The blood drained from his face. Are you the D. Moore? The one who bought Sterling? That's me. He nearly dropped his champagne glass. Oh my God. I had no idea. I mean, when Jake said his mother-in-law was in consulting, I never imagined he was stammering now, completely at a loss. Ms. Moore, I'm so sorry. If I'd known... It's okay, Mr. Johnson. I'm keeping a low profile. But he wasn't okay. He was clearly panicking, running a hand through his hair. Ma'am, I need to apologize for, well, this whole evening. The way people talked to you, treated you like. He glanced around the room where people were still joking about my hobby business. It's humiliating. Mr. Johnson, please don't worry about it. I made a choice not to correct anyone, but you wouldn't have to. Do you realize that half the people in this room work for companies in your portfolio? The way they talked about your little consulting business, while you literally own. He paused, shaking his head in disbelief. Then I knew he was right. Looking around the room, I saw executives from 3 different companies I'd acquired. In the last year, they all treated me like a sweet, deluded, middle-aged woman playing at business. Mr. Johnson, I said quietly, I really don't want to make a scene. It's my daughter's wedding day. But he was too shocked to let it go, ma'am. With all due respect, people need to know. The way your own family, do they have any idea what you've accomplished? No, I admitted. They don't. He stared at me in disbelief. Your daughter doesn't know that her mother is one of the most successful entrepreneurs in our industry. She thinks I have a small consulting business, helping local stores with their paperwork. Local stores, his voice rose slightly. Then he caught himself and lowered it again. Ms. Moore, you've acquired 6 companies in 18 months. You're managing a $50 million portfolio. You're not just successful, you're a powerful force in the industry. I could see other people starting to notice our tense conversation. Jake was looking at us curiously, probably wondering why his boss was talking so seriously to his mother-in-law, who had a business hobby. Mr. Johnson, please, I said. I really don't want to distract from Emily and Jake tonight, but I could see the struggle on his face. As a business professional, he was clearly horrified by the way I was being treated. As someone who worked in an industry where reputation and respect were incredibly important, he couldn't stand to see me being rejected and ridiculed. I understand your concern for your daughter, he said finally. But Ms. Moore, what's happening here is wrong. These people should respect you for more than just a person. They should respect you as their boss. Their boss? Jake works for Sterling Tech, which you now own. The Hendersons over there work for Quantum Solutions. You acquired it in January. The Patels work for Data Flow Systems. That was your March acquisition. He gestured around the room. Half of these people end up on the payroll of companies you control, and they're making jokes about your midlife crisis. I felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness. And here it was. Proof that I'd built something significant, something important. But it also underscored how much my own family had misjudged me and underestimated me. What's really troubling, Johnson continued, is that your daughter's speech was essentially ridiculing you for having unrealistic business ambitions. But you weren't unrealistic. You were incredibly successful. She just didn't know it. Jake was definitely watching us now, and he was starting to approach. Everything okay in here? He asked with a slightly nervous smile. You two seem to be having quite a lively conversation. Johnson looked at me, clearly asking permission with his eyes. I nodded slightly. I was tired of hiding. Jake, Johnson began carefully. I was just learning more about your mother-in-law's consulting business. Oh, that, Jake said with a condescending chuckle. Yeah, Diana's trying her hand at business. It's kind of cute how seriously she takes it. The look of horror that crossed Johnson's face was almost comical. Cute, he repeated. Well, you know how it is when people start over in middle age. They have to be supported, even if their goals are a little optimistic. Jake patted me condescendingly on the shoulder. But we're supporting Diana's little venture, right, Mom? Johnson stared at Jake as if he'd just seen someone insult the present to his face without realizing who he was talking to. Jake, Johnson said slowly, I don't think you realize who you're talking to. What do you mean? Johnson looked at me again, and I nodded slightly again. The cat was ready to jump out of the bag. Your mother-in-law doesn't play business, Jake. She is the business. Diane Moore is D. Moore of DM Consulting. She owns Sterling Tech. She owns the company we work for. Jake's face went completely blank. What? She's not some small consultant helping local stores. She's acquired 6 major companies in the last 18 months, including ours. Jake, your mother-in-law is your boss's boss. The moment Jake's brain finally processed what Johnson was saying was like watching someone get hit by a truck in slow motion. His mouth opened and closed a few times, but no sound came out. Jake finally breathed out. That's impossible. She drives an old Honda. She lives in a small apartment. She's deliberately living a frugal lifestyle, Johnson finished for him. A lot of serious investors do that. It helps them focus on the business rather than the luxuries. Other people were starting to notice that something significant was going on. The conversation was catching my attention, and I could see curious faces turning our way. Johnson seemed to realize that the secret was now completely out. And to be honest, after everything that had happened that evening, I wasn't exactly upset about it. You know what? Johnson said, his voice getting a little louder. I think people should know this. And before I could stop him, he was heading for the microphone. Excuse me, everyone, Johnson said into the microphone, his voice booming throughout the ballroom. I apologize for interrupting the festivities, but I have something remarkable to share with you that I've just discovered. The music stopped. All conversation stopped. 200 people turned to look at him with curious expressions. I wanted to disappear under the table, but it was too late. So, ladies and gentlemen, Johnson continued, I just had the most enlightening conversation with the mother of the bride. I need to apologize to everyone here, and especially to Ms. Diana Moore for this serious misunderstanding. Emily looked at Johnson in confusion, probably wondering why her new husband's boss was talking about me at her wedding reception. You see, we all treated Ms. Moore as if she were some amateur dabbling in business as a hobby. We were condescending to her, oblivious to her accomplishments, and frankly, incredibly rude. The room was dead silent now. I could feel every eye in the room turning to me. What we didn't realize, Johnson's voice grew stronger, is that Diana Moore is actually Dee Moore, founder and CEO of DM Consulting. She is one of the most successful entrepreneurs in our industry. A gasp swept through the room. Someone dropped a fork. I heard Emily choke on her own breath. In the last 18 months alone, Ms. Moore has acquired 6 major companies, including Sterling Tech, where I'm COO, Johnson said, a note of amazement in his voice. She's built a portfolio worth $50 million. While the rest of us treated her like she was playing dress-up, the silence was deafening. Then the commotion began. What? Emily shrieked, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. People were talking all at once. I could see the Hendersons whispering feverishly to each other. They were among those making particularly condescending remarks about my sweet business. The Patels looked like they'd seen a ghost. Jake was still standing there, his mouth open like a fish. What's more, Johnson continued, clearly getting into the swing of things, I should point out that about half the people in this room actually work for companies that Ms. Moore now owns. So when we joked about her unrealistic business dreams, we were essentially making fun of our own boss. That's when the panic really started. I watched as executives and staff frantically tried to remember every disparaging comment they'd made about me that evening. The man who'd compared me to his needlework aunt looked like he was about to throw up. Emily looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Total shock, mixed with something that might have been horror. Mom, she said, her voice barely audible over the noise of the crowd. Is that true? Before I could respond, Johnson spoke again. I think Ms. Moore should answer that question herself. He handed me the microphone. The 200 people fell silent again, all waiting for my answer. This was definitely not how I had planned my daughter's wedding reception. Well, I said, my voice shaking slightly. Yes, it's true. I'm Dee Moore from DM Consulting. The room erupted again, but I kept talking. I know this came as a surprise to many, especially my family. I've kept a deliberately low profile because I prefer to let my work speak for itself rather than seek publicity or recognition. I looked directly at Emily, who was looking at me as if she'd never seen me before. Milka, I didn't tell you because you specifically asked me not to talk about my business tonight. You were embarrassed by what you considered my little consulting hobby, so I respected your wishes and kept quiet. But, Mom, Emily's voice was tiny now. You said you were in small business consulting. I never said small business. I said business consulting. You assumed it was small because I paused, trying to find a diplomatic way to say it, because you thought I was too old and inexperienced to achieve anything significant. The room was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. When you gave that speech earlier about my crisis and how I needed to act my age, you were talking about a business that employs over 400 people across 6 companies. I kept my voice soft but clear. When you said I was unrealistic about what I could achieve, you were talking about accomplishments that had already happened. Jake finally found his voice. Diane, I had no idea. I'm so sorry for everything I said. I feel like such an idiot. Jake, you assumed that a woman my age couldn't possibly know more about business than you do. That's something to think about. But what I was really watching was Emily. My daughter looked absolutely crushed, and not in a good way. She wasn't proud or excited about my success. She looked humiliated at having screwed up so publicly. Mom, she said quietly, why didn't you tell me? Because every time I tried to share good news about my business, you rolled your eyes and changed the subject. You told me which in a slump, you said some dreams have an expiration date. You asked me not to embarrass you by telling your fiancé's coworkers about my work. I gestured around the room, many of whom, it turned out, now worked for me. The effects of this were starting to sink in. I could see people frantically trying to remember if they'd said anything particularly offensive about the deluded old lady and her business fantasies. Johnson stepped forward again. If I may add, he said, Miss Moore has been incredibly generous in the face of today's misunderstandings. A lesser person might have been deeply offended by some of the comments that have been made. Bridesmaid Emily, who had started it all by pontificating about my crisis, looked like she wanted to sink through the floor. But what I find most impressive, Johnson continued, is that Miss Moore was willing to endure public ridicule, rather than let the success of her business overshadow her daughter's wedding. It shows remarkable character and love for her family. Emily actually looked like she was about to cry now, but not with happiness. So, I said into the microphone, I hope you will all forgive the dramatic revelation. This is not how I had planned to spend the evening, but sometimes the truth has a way of coming out. I looked at Emily with all the love I could muster. Now let's get back to celebrating this beautiful couple and their future together. I handed the microphone back to Johnson and sat down. The room gradually returned to a normal level of conversation, but everything had changed. The people who had been condescending to me all evening now approached me with a completely different attitude. Miss Moore, said the man who had compared me to his needlework aunt, I owe you an apology. I didn't know if I'd known ... It's okay, I told him. Really, but it wasn't okay for Emily. By the end of the evening, I could see her struggling to come to terms with the reality of how wrong she'd been about her own mother. When she finally came to me, her eyes were red. Mom, I don't know what to say. I feel terrible about everything. The speech, the way I treated your work, everything. Emily, honey, it's your wedding day. We can't let this ruin it, but I was so terrible to you in front of everyone. And you just sat there and put up with it because you didn't want to ruin my day. She was crying now. What kind of daughter am I for that? What kind of daughter? The one who was more concerned about me embarrassing her than she was about figuring out who I really was? Emily, you stood up in front of 200 people and ridiculed me for refusing to act my age. You told everyone my dreams had an expiration date. That wasn't just wrong, that was cruel. I kept my voice level but firm. You weren't just wrong about the facts. You were willing to publicly humiliate me instead of supporting me. We have some work to do before things can go back to normal. When Jake and Emily left for their honeymoon the next morning, I knew this revelation would significantly change the dynamic in our family. But maybe that wasn't all bad. After all, I was 62 years old, and I had finally stopped letting other people tell me I was too old. 6 months into our wedding, things had changed in ways I never expected. Jake started calling me Miss Moore at family dinners and actually asking my business advice. Turns out he became a lot more deferential once he realized his job security depended on staying in my good graces. Funny how that works, my sister. Stopped lecturing me about realistic expectations and started bragging to her friends about her successful entrepreneur sister. It's amazing how quickly people's tunes change when success becomes undeniable. With Emily and me. Well, it took longer to recover. She came back from her honeymoon expecting everything to go back to normal, but I was adamant about boundaries. We started couples therapy. Yes, at 62, I dragged my 34-year-old daughter to a therapist. Turns out being a powerful businesswoman means you can't put up with bad treatment from anyone, including family. The best part, 3 guests from that wedding contacted me afterward about consulting contracts. Apparently, publicly revealing yourself as a business influencer is great marketing. Who would have thought? And Mr. Johnson, he has become one of my most trusted executives. Sometimes the best business relationships begin with champagne and utter shock. These days, when people ask about my late-night career change, I just smile because, at 62, I've learned the most important business lesson of all. Never underestimate a woman who's decided she's had enough of being underestimated. So that's my story. I'd love to hear what you think. Was Emily's public embarrassment at her own wedding a justifiable comeuppance, or should I have revealed the truth differently? Let me know in the comments and subscribe for more stories like mine.